Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Four Musketeers. In this podcast, we take a closer look at classical literature to analyze the deeper impact behind the texts we read. I'm Bran, and today I'm joined by Hano, Ruby, and Joji.
Glad to be here, Ran. Honestly, I've been looking forward to this discussion all week.
Same here. There is so much to unpack with today's choice.
Yes, absolutely. It's definitely a text that goes way beyond a simple scary story.
It really does. And for this episode, we decided to name it Alter Ego, because we are breaking down a masterpiece of psychological horror.
First, let's dive deep into the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, written in 1886, one of Robert Louis Stevenson's most famous works. The book opens with some deeply uncomfortable questions. Have you ever looked at someone and wished you could change into someone else? Just to be completely free to do whatever you wanted without anyone blaming you?
That is exactly the dangerous thought that drives Dr. Harry Jekyll, a highly clever and respected scientist, to turn that dark fantasy into reality.
But to understand the psychological weight of the book, we have to look at how the story unfolds. Stevenson's structure is almost like a detective novel, but instead of a police officer, our main guide is Mr. Utterson, a quiet but serious lawyer who rarely shows his feelings but is incredibly loyal to his friends.
Right. Utterson is a very strict, traditional man, but he becomes obsessed with a bizarre problem. His wealthy client, Dr. Jekyll, has written a highly unusual will stating that if he dies or disappears for more than 3 months, everything he owns goes to a completely unknown, repulsive man named Edward Hyde.
And the audience learns very quickly that Hyde is a monster. In the very first chapter, Utterson's cousin, Enfield, describes seeing Hyde bump into a little girl on a black winter morning. Instead of helping her, Hyde calmly walks right over her body with heavy boots, leaving her screaming on the ground. It is a completely inhuman act.
Yes, and what I find deeply impactful about that scene is the physical reaction that people have to Hyde. Enfield and the doctor who treats the girl notice that just looking at Hyde makes them feel sick to their stomachs. He has this unpleasing, hateful appearance that nobody can quite describe, but everyone instantly dislikes. It's as if his physical body is a direct manifestation of pure evil.
Exactly, Yoji. And things get significantly worse a year later with the Carrillo murder. A servant girl witnesses Hyde exploding with sudden madness in the street, beating an old polite gentleman named Sir Danvers Carrillo to death with a heavy walking stick. The violence is so brutal she can actually hear the bones breaking.
And here is the turning point for Utterson. The murder weapon is a stick that Utterson himself had given to Henry Jekyll years ago. When Utterson confronts Jekyll about it, the doctor looks completely sick and exhausted. He promises he's done with Hyde forever and hands Utterson a letter signed by Hyde, claiming he has escaped safely.
But Stevenson adds another brilliant layer of mystery here. Utterson shows the letter to his chief clerk, Mr. Guest, who happens to be an expert in studying handwriting. When Guest compares Hyde's letter to a dinner invitation written by Jekyll, they realize the handwriting is practically identical, just tilted differently.
I mean, just imagine Utterson's horror at that moment. He genuinely believes his respectable friend, Dr. Jekyll, is forging letters to protect a cold-blooded murderer. He has absolutely no idea that they are actually sharing the exact same physical body.
And this leads us directly to Jekyll's final confession, which completely redefines the whole story. Jekyll admits that from a young age, he led a double life. On the outside, he was a serious, hard-working doctor, but secretly, he had a wild, fun-loving, irresponsible side. Because Victorian society demanded absolute perfection, he felt deeply ashamed of his weaknesses and learned to keep his two lives completely separate.
That is where his scientific obsession begins. He realized that every human being is a mixture of two characters living uncountably in the same body. He wondered if he could find a drug to separate them, so his wild side could enjoy total freedom without destroying the reputation of the serious Dr. Jekyll.
The tragedy in here is that when he finally drinks the bitter potion, the transformation is agonizing but intoxicating. He feels younger, lighter, and completely carefree. But because Jekyll's good side was already weak from years of repression, the alter ego he released, Edward Hyde, was entirely, purely evil.
Well, and that addiction completely destroys him. Jekyll thinks he can get rid of Hyde anytime he wants, but Hyde eventually becomes the dominant force. It gets so bad that Jekyll goes to bed as a respectable scientist and wake up looking at a thin, hairy, grayish brown hand, the hand of Edward Hyde. He begins transforming spontaneously without even taking the drug.
And by the end, the renal chemical supply runs out. Jekyll discovers that the renal salt he used was accidentally impure, and that specific impurity was what made the experiment work. Unable to replicate it, he locks himself in his study, weeping like a lost child, and until he takes his own life right before Utterson and Poole break the door down with an axe. And now that we have analyzed the plot, let's dig into the actual impact behind the text. So, Ruby, you've looked into the historical background. Why was this story so terrifying to the late Victorian public?
Look, Randolph, to understand the impact, we have to realize that 1886 was a time of massive scientific and social anxiety. Charles Darwin's theories of evolution were still very fresh, and society was genuinely terrified of the idea of atavism, the concept that humans could de-evolve back into primitive animals. Stevenson plays directly into this fear. Look at how Hyde is described: short, light, moving in an active, animalistic way, with a hairy, bony hand. He's literally the embodiment of the Victorian fear of regression.
That's a fantastic point, Ruby. So, Hyde isn't just a monster from a fairy tale. He represents the primitive ape hiding underneath the fancy top hat and gentleman's coat of Victorian society.
Yes, exactly, Hanno. And the setting of London itself is a massive metaphor. The city was deeply divided between the wealthy, respectable West End and the dark, disadvantaged East End. Notice how Jekyll's house perfectly mirrors this geographical division. The front of his house is handsome and respectable, located in a nice square. But the back door, which connects directly to the laboratory, opens into a narrow, dusty, uncared for street where Hyde comes and goes as he pleases.
Wow, so the architecture of Jekyll's house is literally a physical map of his split mind. The respectable facade face to face with polite society and the hidden back door used to indulge his darkest desires.
That observation perfectly connects to the main theme of the novel, the duality of human nature. Jekyll explicitly states that man is not truly one, but truly two. But let's look critically at Jekyll's character. Hanno, do you think Jekyll is a sympathetic figure or is he a hypocrite?
Honestly, Rand, I think he is deeply hypocritical. And that is where the real psychological depth lies. Jekyll didn't create the drug to cure evil or help humanity. He created it because he wanted to indulge in shameful, irresponsible adventures without facing any social consequences or damaging his high reputation. He wanted a mask. He even admits that in the early days he found it highly amusing that nobody knew Hyde, allowing him to step into that body and do whatever he wished completely free of blame.
Absolutely, Hanno. He wanted the pleasures of sin without the burden of guilt. But Stevenson's ultimate lesson is that you cannot separate the two sides of your character without destroying yourself. By isolating his evil side, he gave it full autonomy, and eventually the monster consumed the creator.
Yes, and we can also see this destruction through Dr. Lanyon. Dr. Lanyon, well, represents rigid, traditional, orthodox science, and he completely dismissed Jekyll's work as imaginative and unscientific rubbish. When he is forced to witness Hyde drinking the green potion and transforming back into Jekyll right in front of his eyes, his entire scientific worldview just collapses. The shock is so severe that he literally loses the will to live and dies shortly after. Stevenson is showing us that Victorian society simply wasn't ready to face the truth of its own hidden darkness.
And this brings us to a very important part of today's discussion. As future English teachers and as the host of a professional literary podcast, we have to ask ourselves, should this strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde still have a place in the modern classrooms? Joey, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first, I strongly believe this text is an incredible tool, particularly for upper intermediate language learners like a B2 level class. Linguistically, it offers a wealth of abstract vocabulary just looking at the words like reputation, respectable, shameful, temptation, and confession. These aren't just simple vocabulary words. They are complex concepts that force students to move past simple descriptions and engage in advanced moral arguments, which is a key requirement for the B2 level.
I agree with you, Yoyi. From a motivational standpoint, psychological horror is highly engaging for young adults and teenagers. It is far more stimulating for a student to debate why a scientist turned himself into a violent criminal than to read a standard uninspiring textbook article about hobbies or vacations.
That's true, Heino. But we also have to consider the difficulty. Original Victorian English can be incredibly frustrating for non-native speakers due to the complex sentence structures. How would you handle that in a real classroom?
Well, that's a fair concern. In a real classroom, I wouldn't necessarily use the original text right away. I'd probably start with an adapted version so students can focus on understanding the story and its themes before actually dealing with the challenges of Victorian English.
But what kind of practical activities could we design around it?
Oh, well, there are so many options. Like, for instance, you could organize a mock trial activity. One half of the classroom acts as the defense, arguing that Dr. Jekyll was suffering from a severe psychological illness and wasn't responsible, while the other half acts as the prosecution, arguing that he knowingly created a murderer to escape social judgment. This forces students to use advanced conditional structures naturally and apply critical thinking at the same time.
That's brilliant! You could also do a creative writing task where students have to write a missing diary entry from the perspective of Poole, the loyal servant, describing the terrifying, unfamiliar voice and the weeping sounds coming from the locked study during that final week. It practices descriptive language and narrative tenses perfectly.
Well, our time is almost up, so let's conclude with our final evaluations of the work. Hanu, what is your closing reflection on this book?
For me, the enduring legacy of Jekyll and Hyde is that it shifts the concept of horror. The real monster isn't an external creature like a vampire or a ghost. It is the dark, repressed side of our own minds that we choose to ignore. It's a timeless warning about the cost of living a double life.
In addition, historically, it remains a brilliant critique of Victorian social hypocrisy, showing how a rigid demand for total respectability can actually breed intense psychological damage.
Yeah, and educationally, it serves as a perfect example of how classical literature can be adapted to challenge language learners, pushing them to develop critical thinking and complex speaking skills.
Thank you all so much for your insights today, and to our audience. Next time you look at your reflection, and make sure you truly know who is looking back at you. Thank you for listening to The Four Musketeers. Make sure to take a look at our podcast cover art on our YouTube channel and leave a comment below if you had the choice. Would you risk drinking Dr. Jekyll's potion? Until next time, goodbye.
Bye!
Goodbye,
See ya. Bye bye.